Hello there, welcome to my channel. This is the final in a three-part series of the Bigme Hibreak Pro, which is an e-ink phone. And the first video was an unboxing, the second video was a visual tour where I really just focused on the features of the device and kind of what it's like to use the device. And then this is going to be the formal review. So we're going to go over what I think the strengths are, things I found kind of odd but aren't strengths or weaknesses, and then the weaknesses in detail. And then in particular, we're going to go into, I'm going to talk about, who I think this is for and who I might or might not recommend the phone for. Am I going to be using the phone? I'll talk about that and then we'll wrap it up. So all that is in this video. So let's go ahead and dig on in. Okay, so starting with the pros of the device, and we're going to be listing these alphabetically. The first thing that I'm going to call out is the fact that apps can work in landscape mode. So it's not just in portrait mode. But as you saw on the visual tour, you can see most apps in landscape mode as well. That's great. It makes better use of the screen. In addition to that, the battery life I thought was really good. Now, I didn't do formal tests on the battery life. I don't normally test phones, but I'll just give you an anecdote. So if you go to full power and then you don't touch it for about a day, you're going to lose about 10% of the battery. So that's a very slow drain. In addition to that, that's 10% using this type of screensaver where the clock is changing every minute and of course the calendar is changing every day. So that actually would probably have drained the battery more than if I used a static screensaver. So it really does sit battery life. I wouldn't say it's dramatically better than say my Pixel 7 phone, for example, but I thought the battery life was more than acceptable and it lasted days through kind of light to medium usage. The Bluetooth connection was great, and one of the experiments that I used with the device is I put Bluetooth earphones on, connected them to the phone, and then I left here and walked around my neighborhood listening to music. And this is actually an interesting test, partly because I'm going from Wi-Fi, which I have in my home, to the 5G network when I leave. And some devices struggle with that transition. Music will stop and you have to restart it manually. That didn't happen in this case. There was no interruption whatsoever. And the Bluetooth sounds were great from beginning to the end of the walk, which lasted for a little over half an hour. So really good Bluetooth connection. The call quality is really good, and I want to show kind of a demo of that, or I guess hear a demo of that. What I have here is I have my Pixel 7 phone, and I made 2 phone calls to the phone. Now, one phone call was from a desk phone, and I'm going to go ahead and play that right now. Okay, so I have it on speaker, and I'm going to go ahead and play this.
Hello, this is a test message from a desk phone, and this will be a control to compare against the Bigme Hibreak Pro.
Okay, so that was that message. And now let's go ahead and listen to a phone message from the Hibreak Pro.
Hi there, this is an example of what it sounds like when you're on the other end listening to my voice from the e-ink Hibreak phone.
So as you can see, I actually prefer the call quality from the phone than I did from my office phone, which was a VoIP phone. So that's just an example of that. I think it has really good call quality. And that was just using the phone itself. That wasn't using a Bluetooth microphone. The fact that you can change the refresh settings per app, and in particular the DPI settings, and we showed this off in the visual tour, is really important. This really allows you to kind of customize the apps to make sure that they look great on the device. And so having those features available and not too complicated, so once you understand where they are, it's pretty easy to engage in, and you only have to go through a setup process once per app essentially. So it's really great to have these features, and I thought they were really well implemented. The fact that you have custom buttons on the side of the phone is great. They have a lot of selections. I'm sure there's something there that they don't do. That's just the way it always is. But I was impressed by the list of things available and the functionality of those buttons. So that I thought was a really strong point for the phone. The customizable drop-down tray where you can select the icons that you have as shortcuts on the device is great. It was fully customizable, and I really appreciated that. I think the speakers are relatively decent, and we showed that off a little bit in the visual tour video. You know, they're not great speakers, but you don't expect great speakers. For a mid-range phone, I thought they were fantastic. Photos are good. So we're going to go here through a series of photos where I'm going to compare photos I took from the Bigme device to photos I took from the Pixel 7 Pro. Now the Pixel 7 Pro, of course, is a premium phone. Those photos are going to look better. But the theme that I saw through these pictures is how good the Bigme photos looked. You know, not as good as the Pixel Pro phone, but more than acceptable. So we'll start off here. This is an indoor image and no flash. And we can see the comparison of the two. And you do see color differences, and you do see a little bit more detail on the 7 Pro, but I still think the Hibreak took a pretty decent photo. Here's an outdoor photo. It was a slightly cloudy day, mostly sunny, and then you can see the differences there. Here's a photo indoors in darker lighting, no flash. You can see the differences there. And then here's a nighttime photo with flash as well. In addition to that, I did take 2 videos. These 2 videos were taken at the exact same time. I literally held the phones next to each other and pressed play at the same time, so it's shooting the same footage. And the quality is comparable, the difference in quality, rather, is comparable to the difference in the photos as well. So across the board, I thought the camera on this Hibreak phone was more than acceptable, solid for a mid-range phone. Screen responsiveness was quite good on the device. I do want to emphasize that this is in context to using e-ink device. The responsiveness on an e-ink device will never match the snappiness of, you know, a premium or even mid-range LCD screen. So this really is just in the context of e-ink. But from that perspective, I thought the device was really snappy, particularly in extreme mode. And you can see examples of that all through the previous visual tour video. Data connection was great. I never had any issues with it. Not as good as my Pixel phone, but in my house, where I have pretty good cellular coverage, I was getting really amazing download and upload speeds. A little bit less than my Pixel phone at work, which is in a totally different city, but it was still more than acceptable for what you need on a phone. And finally, you know, as always, of course, text looks really sharp, and that's what you would expect with an e-ink device, and that's definitely the case here. So much so that if the text was really small, as was the case in some of the notifications, I didn't have a problem reading it. It was still sharp in that context. Finally, the last Pro, typing was really responsive. I never felt like the screen, and this might have been how I had it set up, but I never felt like, you know, as I'm looking at the keyboard that, you know, I didn't feel connected to the typing. But what I did notice is as long as I just said, just focus on what I want to type and just do it and don't worry about what the screen's telling me, it would always capture what I was typing perfectly. So the actual typing, if you just ignore, you know, like say the keys flashing or, you know, I didn't have any sounds on to indicate me selecting the buttons, put that aside. But the responsiveness of the keyboard was flawless as I typed on it. Okay, so now we're kind of going into things that I thought weren't necessarily great, but they weren't bad either. So I'm just calling these average things that I wanted to call out about the phone. The first thing is, of course, it's in black and white only. And some people may think that that might be a pro for them. It could be a con, so I kind of put it in the middle. I don't mind the black and white necessarily, and for reading, of course, it's perfectly fine. But you do lose a bit on images, for example, and of course in the system, you know, the lack of color is pretty noticeable when you put it side by side with a phone that does have a really nice color screen. So it's certainly worth pointing out. The fingerprint reader is very finicky. You had to be very direct on that reader in order for it to work. And that's different from my Pixel phone, for example, where my fingerprint reader could be, you know, at a different degree and it would still read it. Here you had to be straight on. So I found that to be a finicky experience. The frame makes the screen seem really dark, and I thought this was a really odd aesthetic choice. So if you look at this phone, what you'll notice is on the outside is the widest portion of the device. And then there's kind of the bezel, and that's a slightly darker, lighter gray. And then that makes the screen the darkest of the three tones. I found that odd. It's not a huge deal breaker, but to me, wouldn't it have been better to have black, gray, and then make the screen look the lightest of the three colors? I just kind of felt like by doing it this way, they really highlighted the fact that the screen is kind of dark for what it is. I just thought it was an odd aesthetic choice. Functionally, it didn't really matter, so that's why I put this in this average category. Images looked okay. In some places, it looked better than others, but I think generally speaking, you don't see a lot of detail in the images. And that's the result partly of the e-ink screen, partly probably because of the size of the screen relative to the images. I wouldn't call it bad, but it definitely is, unlike text, which is perfect for e-ink. I think images were kind of more of a middling experience on this device. Again, certainly functional, but I did notice that. You do need time to set the phone up properly, and I've seen other people comment on this, and we kind of touched on this in the good area where, yes, you can do refresh settings and your DPI settings per app, and you only have to do that once, but you have to go through each app to set that up. Now, of course, you're not going to go through all your apps to do that, right? You're only going to go through the apps that you actually use, and maybe even just the ones you use frequently. So it's not a huge deal, but really to make the phone work for you, just know that there is a little bit of effort in the front to kind of set it up to work in the way that's best for your situation. So that is something to note. There's no wireless charging. That's pretty straightforward. You just have to plug it in. The charging itself was fine. Again, I didn't time this, but I was satisfied relative to my other devices. It's not a fast charger, but it charged an acceptable rate, in my opinion. I don't like the design, honestly. And I'll tell you, I actually had a coworker, I handed the phone to her, and she made the comment, I can't get this out of my mind. She basically said, this kind of looks like a Fisher-Price phone. And she pointed out specific aspects of it. And it's partly, it's the thickness of the device. There's just a kind of clunkiness to it. And some of the app icons, too, are really kind of simple, particularly the system icons that you have on the lower tray. It's not, certainly not a premium phone, of course, but even for a mid-level phone, I think from a design perspective, it's a little bit lacking. And again, this is where the coloration, I think, also plays a factor. Going with kind of white or cream themes was a poor choice. I don't think it's going to age well. Also, kind of on the same theme is the screen. It's not unusual to have e-ink screens look a little bit sunken, but normally you don't notice that as much unless you're looking at the edges. And it's possible that the only reason you notice it here is because it's such a smaller screen, so you're going to see the edges in your normal field of view. But I found it looked unusually sunken, particularly for a device that doesn't have, a Wacom layer, so you're not, writing notes with a stylus on it. That usually creates a little bit of that depth. You do have front lighting, that's definitely going to be playing a major factor, but it really struck me how sunken the screen looked. Now, the top of it is flush. So even though it looks sunken, the actual screen itself goes edge to edge. So there's no rim there basically to rub against, but still visually, I didn't think it was that great. Again, we talked about how apps could be in either portrait or landscape. The system only operates in portrait mode. Not a huge deal, but something I wanted to call out. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the things that I really think are detractors to the phone, and that would be heavy considerations if you were thinking about buying it. And it's going to start off with ghosting. Now, this is a little bit of a caveat here. Relative to e-ink devices, I didn't think the ghosting was that bad. There, within the widget screen, it was pretty apparent, and you can see ghosting in other places as well. I thought it was generally managed well, but I'm listing it here because it doesn't matter if you're talking budget, mid-range, or premium. LCD phones have no ghosting, and to be clear, ghosting is an after image. So imagine you have one screen, you switch to another, and you see little elements of that previous screen in your current screen. That's something you have to experience on an e-ink device. So again, the ghosting by itself isn't terrible, but the fact that it exists at all is a kind of a downgrade from what we're expected or used to in our phones. There's no water or dust rating on the device. Even mid-level devices now have some form of water resistance, not always, but in some cases. So it was notable to call that out. This is a small one. Again, these are in alphabetical order, and they're not in order of impact. And this is probably a small impact item. But sometimes fonts looked a little bit wonky, and they didn't translate well on an e-ink screen. Didn't happen a lot. But I do want to call this out because in e-ink screens, well, let me reverse that. Apps were not designed to work on e-ink screens natively. So sometimes it works really well, and in many of the apps I looked at looked fine. But in other times, you'll see menu items will be hidden because it was relying on certain subtleties in the color, which you can't pick up on an e-ink device, particularly at certain contrast settings. And then, of course, this font issue. So this represents a broader issue of you are going to run into issues from time to time where the app just isn't optimized for e-ink, and it will come through and be a less than stellar experience. So not huge. I didn't experience that a lot as I went through the device, but it's certainly a factor to consider. The system, very unstable. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of that. I could give more, but these are the 2 that stick out for me. So in the visual tour video, at one point, I basically showed the customization of the drop-down bar and how all those shortcuts can be removed and you can add any combination you want in any order you want. That worked well in that video, but previous, in testing, I had removed all of them and then pressed the reset button for them all to come back, and they didn't come back. I had to restart the phone in order for that to take effect. So that's one example. Here's a little more of a chilling example. So at one point, I was working with the phone, and then all of a sudden, it started just wigging out. Screens were popping up everywhere. And in the course of this, it went into my contacts list and called one of my contacts. I couldn't shut down the phone. So literally, the call went through, I heard the voicemail, and then I went into voicemail before I figured out that I could hold down the power button, keep it held down, and then press the power button to shut down the device and reboot it. Crazy. Now, I only had that experience once, but it was pretty chilling. I couldn't control this phone from calling someone. I've never had an experience like that before. Now, there's been other system issues as well, a little more subtle. I probably had to reboot the device, I think 4 times in total because of kind of issues with the system. So it's not stable. And I would say it works most of the time. I don't want to overstate this, but it doesn't work enough that it really does stick out because I'm not used to that with phones. I'm used to e-ink devices that maybe when you initially get them, you may have to reboot them once, maybe twice, but I've never seen quite at this frequency nor this serious of an issue. So it's definitely something that I'm compelled to call out. This is the last con, and widgets are terribly implemented on this device. Not only are they predominantly isolated to the one screen, but a lot of times widgets don't work or they don't work properly. I don't think they look particularly great. Ghosting is most prominent on the widget screen than any others in my experience. I'm not quite sure why that is. Some widgets work perfectly fine. Spotify worked great, no issues. I could use it to advance tracks and what have you. I could use it to go into the app. Others just didn't work at all. And the overall implementation just leaves a lot to be desired. If you're someone that likes to use widgets on your phone, this is a serious consideration not to go with this device because I was really surprised how poorly implemented it was. Okay, so having gone through all that detail, I think it's probably best to just kind of summarize who I think the phone is for. Now, let's start off. There's a key question that you have to ask yourself, and the question is, do I want a phone with an e-ink screen? Now, there could be a lot of reasons why you would answer yes to that. And the most prominent is people that are concerned about eye strain, and they're looking for a device that has a much more gentler screen on their eyes. So let's kind of branch out from that. So let's say the answer to the question is no. You're not necessarily, you don't have a need for an e-ink phone. You might be curious about it, that's why you're watching, but you're fine with an LCD phone. In that case, I would not recommend this device, because there's all sorts of sacrifices that you're giving up in order to get that e-ink screen, whether it's around responsiveness. So even though responsiveness is good, I think for an e-ink device, you're definitely giving that up relative to an LCD device. You're giving up, color, of course, and vibrancy. You're giving up some little bit of functionality, and I can go on. And I did go through the details of where the device was kind of a little bit not necessarily good or bad, and then the areas where it was bad. All those things you're sacrificing to get an e-ink screen. So for a vast majority of people, the answer is going to be no. It doesn't make sense to use the phone. Now let's say, though, your answer is yes. Again, we'll just go with the concept of I want a device with less eye strain. Would I recommend the phone to those individuals? And it comes down to, are you willing to make those sacrifices, those things I just talked about, for that e-ink screen? If the answer is yes, that you are, then it's actually a really solid mid-level phone, right? It works great as a phone. You can text on it. It takes, I think, pretty good pictures. The Bluetooth connection is great. All the things I talked about in the pros. It's a solid mid-range phone with an LCD screen. So I think for people that really are looking to get away from an LCD screen, again, for whatever reason, predominantly because of eye fatigue, then I would recommend it for those people. But that's going to be a very small segment of people that fall into that category, in my opinion. So that kind of leads us then to the question of, will I be using the phone? And the answer is definitely not. I don't fall into that camp of people who get eye strain. As many people on this channel know, I love e-ink, really love the technology, and I love it in particular for reading and writing, and I've got devices to do that. A phone is a place where I really do appreciate how much my phone can do, how snappy it is, how vibrant it looks, and so on. And I really don't feel the need to go from my Pixel 7 Pro down to this e-ink device. I'm not gaining anything, but I am losing things in that process. So as much as I think for a certain segment of the population that this might be a good phone for them, it's definitely not a good phone for me. All right, well, that does it. I do have to say I did enjoy reviewing the Hibreak phone. I found it really interesting. When I initially used it, I was kind of surprised how well it did certain things. And of course, we've talked about all those in the good aspects of the device. If you have any questions or comments, pop those into the chat and I'll try to answer or respond to them as best I can. Please subscribe. I'll be doing e-ink device reviews, rest of the year. So there's more to come, and I hope to see you there. Until then, I hope you have a great day.